Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In this video I want to give you an update on what's happening in South Korea. Now South Korea was previously the 10th largest economy in the world, but it's just posted its biggest ever deficit for 2022, so it's now dropped down to the 12th largest economy in the world. And the figures for January are also looking extremely bad, so it's looking likely that South Korea is going to go into recession by the end of the first quarter of 2023. So in today's video, as this is the first time that I've looked at South Korea, we'll have a brief history of the country. We'll look at what resources it's got, how it's grown over the last 50 years. We'll then look at some of the key economic indicators, such as the imports and the exports, the balance of trade, the current account. We'll have a look at what's going on with regards to inflation and interest rates. We'll then look at the most recent set of results to establish exactly what's going on in the economy, why things have started to go so badly. And then we'll go on to talk about the birth rate and the population pyramid, because South Korea actually has the lowest birth rate of any country in the world. It's got a declining population, and that's going to lead to some major problems over the course of the next 20 to 30 years. So I'll have a look at what's going on there, and then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen for South Korea over the course of the next 3 to 6 months, and what the impact of this is going to be for the global economy. So before we get started on all of that, I'm going to ask you for a thumbs up. I'm going to remind you that I always include chapters, so if you don't have time to watch everything, you can pick and choose what you'd like to see. And if you would like to support the channel, please have a look below where you'll find links to YouTube super thanks and membership, as well as buy me a coffee and Patreon. And as always, thank you so much to everyone that has supported the channel. Genuinely appreciate it. South Korea occupies the southern part of the Korean peninsula and has one land border with North Korea. Now, in terms of the history of how North and South Korea were created, up until the end of World War II, the country was actually just one country called Korea. However, because of long-standing divisions within the country, at the end of World War II, it was decided that the Soviet Union should install a government in the north of the country, and the USA would work with the government in the south. And at that time, it was intended that both countries would ultimately merge to create an enlarged Korea. However, between 1945 and 1950, the Cold War got in the way, and the Soviet Union established a communist government in North Korea. And in 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea with the intention of overtaking the country. This led to the outbreak of the Korean War, which lasted for 3 years and resulted in more than 2.5 million deaths. A peace treaty was finally signed in 1953, and a demilitarized zone was established across what's known as the 38th parallel, which runs across the 38-degree north latitude line. And this divided situation has remained in place for the last 70 years. South Korea does not have an abundance of natural resources, and less than 25% of all of its land is cultivated. As a result of this, it's a net importer of energy and food products. Education is highly valued in South Korea, and over the last 60 years, it's developed its economy to focus on high-tech engineering and electronics. This table shows the market capitalization of the top 10 companies in South Korea, and as you can see, the largest by far is the electronics giant Samsung, which produces a variety of different electronic products, including the smartphone, which is the biggest competitor to iPhone. The second largest business is LG Energy Solutions, which produces batteries. The third is SK Hynix, which is one of the largest microchip producers in the world. Number 4 is Samsung's biotech company, Samsung Biologics. 5 is LG Chem, the chemicals division of LG. 6 is Samsung SDI, the battery division of Samsung. 7 is Hyundai, the car company. 8 is Coupang, which is South Korea's equivalent of Amazon. 9 is Naver, which is South Korea's equivalent of Google. And 10 is the car company Kia. So as you can see from this list, the South Korean economy is dominated by tech and electronics. In 2022, South Korea recorded a trade deficit of $47.5 billion, which is the largest ever in the country's history. This chart dates back to 1956, which is the start of record keeping in South Korea, which shows the dramatic fall in the trade balance over the last 5 years. In 2017, South Korea posted a surplus of more than $95 billion. However, you can see that since that point, there has been a virtually vertical drop in the trade balance to the current deficit of $47.5 billion. And if you compare the current situation to the previous worst points in history, this is significantly worse. In 2008, after the global financial crisis struck, the trade deficit was $13.3 billion. And in 1996, when there was a serious fall in the South Korean economy, the deficit was $20.6 billion. So $47.5 billion is off the scale compared with the worst periods in South Korean history. And to compound matters further, in January, exports fell by $46.3 billion, which equated to around 16.6%. And imports also fell by $59 billion, which equated to around 2.6%. And both of these declines were significantly worse than the market's expectations. As a result of this, the deficit in January was $12.7 billion, again higher than expectations. Now, in terms of providing an explanation as to what's going on, South Korea's Minister of Economy and Finance stated that the widening trade deficit in January is widely seen to be due to seasonal factors, such as an import in energy exports for the winter, as well as a sudden drop in chip prices leading to a worsened picture. In addition to this, it's been reported that the global demand for smartphones fell in the last quarter of 2022, which led to a drop of around 18% in smartphone shipments. And to highlight South Korea's problems further, chipmaker Samsung Electronics reported its worst quarterly profit in 8 years, whilst SK Hynix also posted a record loss for the period. This chart shows the breakdown of South Korea's exports by category. And as you can see, the dominant category is electronics and electronic equipment, which equates to around 31% of all exports. Machinery equates to around 12% and vehicles 10%. And in terms of which countries South Korea is exporting to, its largest single customer is China, which represents around 26% of all exports, followed by the United States, which is coming in at 16%, Vietnam 9%, Hong Kong 6%, Japan 5%, and India 2.5%. And if you've been following the channel, you'll be aware that China has been experiencing difficulties in its economy over the course of the last 6 months or so. So this would go some way to explaining the poor results for South Korea, because the economy of its largest single customer is currently in the doldrums. And this chart shows the breakdown of South Korea's imports by category. And as you can see, the largest single category is the import of oil and energy products, which equates to around 22%. And this again goes some way to explaining the problems that South Korea is experiencing right now. Because over the course of the last 12 months, we've seen an increase in the price of energy products. And this is causing problems for all countries that are net importers. And this chart shows the countries that South Korea is importing from. And as you can see, its largest trading partner for imports is also China, which represents around 24%, followed by the United States at 13%, Japan at 9%, Australia at 6%, and Saudi Arabia and Vietnam at 4%. And this chart shows the monthly movement in the balance of trade over the last 12 months. And the balance of trade is simply the difference between the value of your exports, so what you're being paid, and the cost of your imports, so what you're paying away. And as you can see, in every single month since April 22, South Korea has experienced a negative balance of trade. Russia's invasion of Ukraine started on the 24th of February 2022, and you can see the direct impact on the balance of trade for South Korea. The increase in the cost of all of the energy products meant that it was paying more for its imports than it was receiving for its exports. And that situation has got worse over the course of the last 6 months or so. As we've seen a global slowdown, we've seen demand for products such as microchips and electronics starting to fall, and that means that South Korea is now seeing a fall in its exports at the same time as it's having to pay more for its imports, and that means that it's now having to draw on its reserves. This chart shows the monthly movement in inflation in South Korea over the last 12 months. As you can see, in January 2022, inflation was actually at a relatively low level of 3.6%. Following the global increase in energy prices, inflation did start to increase in March, April, May, June and July, and hit a peak of 6.3% at the end of July. However, since that point, it has started to come back down again and is currently sitting at 5%, which is still considerably above the target rate of 2%. And as a result of this, the central bank has been increasing interest rates over the course of the last 12 months. This chart shows the movement in interest rates. And as you can see, this time last year, the rate of interest in South Korea was 1.25%. However, over the course of the last 9 months, there have been multiple interest rate increases, and the current rate of interest is 3.5%. So South Korea is obviously facing a number of major challenges from an economic perspective, but it's also got a major demographic problem. It's got the lowest birth rate out of any country in the whole of the world. And that means that the population is now in decline. When you look at the birth rate for a country, you're always comparing it to what's called the replacement rate. And the replacement rate is basically the rate of reproduction that you need to keep the population of your country level. And although you may think that the replacement rate should be set at 2 because it's 2 parents producing 2 children, it's actually set at 2.1. And the reason for that is that globally, there are more males than females being born. There are roughly around 105 boys to every 100 girls. So as a result of that, the replacement rate is actually set at 2.1. And this chart shows the birth rate in South Korea dating back to 1960. So you can see back in those days, the birth rate was sitting at around 6. So every female was having around 6 children, which obviously means an expanding population. That's equivalent to the birth rate that we're seeing in countries like Nigeria at the moment. However, you can see that the birth rate dropped dramatically in the 60s and the 70s. And by around 1983, South Korea had hit the replacement rate of 2.1, but unfortunately the birth rate carried on falling, and by the end of the 90s it was down to around 1.7. However, over the last 30 years there's been a continued fall in the birth rate, and the rate now is officially 0.81. And as this chart shows, that ranks South Korea as the lowest in the world, behind Singapore, Hong Kong and Malta. And this chart shows the death rate for South Korea dating back to 1960. So you can see that back in those days, around 13 people were dying out of every 1,000 of population, which compared to a birth rate of around 6. And whilst there was a dramatic fall during the 1960s and it came down to around 6 per 1,000, over the course of the last 50 years we saw a drop to a record low of around 5. However, in the last 10 years or so, the death rate has started to increase and is now sitting at around 6 deaths per 1,000 people. And that compares to a birth rate of 0.81. So why has the birth rate dropped so dramatically in South Korea to become the worst in the world? Well, there's a number of different factors. Firstly, it's been reported that a lot of South Korean women want to focus on work rather than having families. There's been a change in aspirations in the population, and a lot of young women want to become successful in their career rather than starting a young family. And that trend has also led to a fall in the number of marriages, which is evidenced by this chart, which shows that in 2011, around 325,000 marriages were recorded. However, by 2021, the number of recorded marriages was down to around 190,000. And in addition to rising career aspirations and the fall in the number of marriages, it's also been reported that it's much more expensive now to have a family in South Korea, and real estate prices have put people off having families because they want to have their own place and they can't afford to buy one because it's so expensive. Now, this chart shows the current population pyramid for South Korea, and if you follow the channel, you'll know that we've looked at this for a number of different countries. And this chart shows us the number of different people in each age bracket, split between male and female. Male in the blue section on the left, and female in the red section on the right. And the categories are 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15 to 19, all the way up to 100. And you can start to see the problems that South Korea are facing from the shape of this pyramid. Because they've had a reducing birth rate over the course of the last 30 years, you can see that the number of young people is less than the number of older people. And that's going to cause them a number of problems. Firstly, they've got a declining number of people entering the workforce each year. Secondly, they've got an aging population, so people are getting older, and that's going to put a burden onto the state because they're going to need to support all of those people as they go into old age. And thirdly, they've got a declining population. If we move this chart on by 5 years, you can see that in 2028 it's getting worse. By 2033, there is a very thin base to this pyramid. In 2038, it's even worse. And if I keep clicking on, you can see that this pyramid is no longer anywhere like a pyramid. It's becoming a straight line. And by 2100, you can see there are major problems in Korea. Now, if we jump up to this total population chart, you can see that the total population is currently around 52 million. But over the course of the next 70 years, there is a serious decline in population. If we click this through, you can see that every 5 years there is a fall in population, and that's going to cause major problems because the less people you've got, that means the less taxes that you're taking, the less GDP that you're generating, and that's going to mean that the state will struggle to be able to support all of those older people. Because in an ideal world, you have an expanding workforce to create more tax revenue, which means that you can then pay for more infrastructure and support the elderly. So with the declining population, it's going to be a major challenge for South Korea. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been covering a lot of different countries in terms of what the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent rise in energy prices all across the world has been on various economies. And as it sits right now, we're expecting a number of countries to go into recession during the course of 2023. But South Korea is a really interesting case study because all of the other countries that we've covered so far have been countries who are net importers. So they're having to import large quantities of energy and food. But those countries have been developing, so they've been relatively unstable anyway before this period started, and this has really tipped them over the edge. But South Korea is actually one of the biggest economies in the world. Prior to 2022, it was ranked as number 10 in terms of global GDP. And not only is it a big economy, it's also advanced in terms of the type of products that it's exporting. This is at the cutting edge of high tech and microchips. So you'd expect this sort of economy to do well. However, what South Korea is experiencing right now is a double whammy. Firstly, there was a big increase in all of its import prices. So the price of oil and coal and other things that were essential to the economy of South Korea rose dramatically following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that started to hurt them from the balance of trade perspective. The cost of their imports went up dramatically. But at the same time as that, what we've seen over the last 6 months is a global slowdown. Now, that global slowdown has been caused partly by the increase in all of the energy prices, which drove up inflation, which then meant that a lot of central banks started to increase their interest rates. And as those interest rates went up, that meant that the cost of borrowing increased for a lot of people and companies. So that meant that we had a reduction in spending. Everybody started to watch their pennies a bit more. And as a result of that, we've seen a reduction in demand and a slowdown in the global economy. And South Korea, because it's at the cutting edge of technology, is experiencing the sharp end of that. Because one of the first things that people cut back on is upgrading their technology. Because if you don't need to do it, you can wait another 6 or 12 months. And South Korea are starting to feel that pain. And there's been a fall in the price of microchips and semiconductors over the course of the last few months. So unfortunately for South Korea, they've been hit from both sides. They've seen a drop in the value of their exports at the same time as the cost of their imports has gone up. So that's why South Korea have found themselves in this position right now. And over the course of the next 3 to 6 months, it's likely that this trend is going to continue. We are in the middle of a global slowdown. It's likely to continue for at least the next 6 months. So South Korea are likely to see a continued slowdown in demand for their products. That means that the value of their exports will stay low. Now, whilst we have seen a reduction in energy prices, it's not coming quick enough to be able to reverse the trend in South Korea and put them back into the black. Now, South Korea recorded a fall in GDP in the quarter ending December 2022, and 2 consecutive falls in quarterly GDP equates to a recession. So it's likely that at the end of the first quarter of 2023, South Korea will see another fall in its GDP. We've seen the figures for January. They're fairly bad. They would need to have a spectacular February and March to be able to reverse that position. That's unlikely. So it's quite likely that South Korea will go into an official recession during 2023. The question of when they will come out of that recession is difficult to answer because it really depends on what's happening with the global economy. If the global economy bounces back in Q2 of 2023, then South Korea will follow suit. If it doesn't, if it remains in the doldrums, then South Korea could experience a prolonged recession, which could go through to the second half of 2023. But one of the bigger challenges that South Korea is facing in the medium to long term is what's going on with its population. Because it's got the lowest birth rate in the world and its death rate is relatively high, it's seeing a reduction in its population month on month at the moment. And the current population of 52 million is forecast to reduce to around 25 million by the end of this century. And obviously that's going to be really bad news from South Korea's point of view, because when you've got a reducing number of people, you've got reducing demand, you've got reducing productivity, you've got reducing GDP, and the whole economy goes into a downward spiral. And it's very difficult to be able to reverse that trend, because as I mentioned earlier in the video, one of the reasons that they've got reducing birth rates is that there's been a change in mentality in South Korea. People are now focused on their careers, making money, rather than setting up families and having children. And that's a very difficult mindset to turn around. So the overall summary of today's video is that the current situation in South Korea looks fairly bad. It's likely to continue for at least the next few months, if not the next 6 months. It's likely that South Korea will officially go into recession, and that position will only be reversed when the global economy starts to pick up, which is probably going to be in the second half of 2023. So the outlook for the immediate term term for South Korea is not good, but the long-term outlook for South Korea is much, much worse. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up, and thanks for watching this video all the way through to the end.